very good example of most of the habitats from across this region. There are the open waters of Port Phillip, there's basalt reefs, seagrass beds, mudflats, mangroves, saltmarsh, coastal shrubs and grassland. And then after the development of the houses on Jawbone, 2 stormwater treatment lakes, as I showed before, were constructed and added very important freshwater wetland habitat. So we'll have a closer look at some of those habitats at Jawbone. Now, Port Phillip it's a big shallow bay that supports a huge variety of marine life and birds. So mammals that live in Port Phillip Bay include seals here playing out off Williamstown, dolphins. There's a substantial pods of dolphins that it was discovered through some work done in the first 10 years or so of the 20th century, that they were actually a separate species of dolphin called the Baranan dolphin. They exist in Port Phillip Bay and in Gippsland Lakes. There's probably about 150 to 200 animals. There's also a water rat that lives on the shores in Williamstown, in Hobsons Bay, called the Ricali. It's quite a big animal with a long tail with a big white tip and is nocturnal. So the best time to see it obviously is at dusk, or if you want to get up really early in the morning. Occasionally you can see them swimming in the daytime, but not very often. And Jawbone's not that good a place because access isn't that, there's not a lot of access to the actual coast. But if you go to the Strand and Greenwich Bay and walk along the rock wall there, I believe you can see them quite readily, in the evening. Now, there's also lots of birds, obviously, that use Port Phillip Bay. And one of the great birding experiences of Port Phillip happens in winter, when all the small bait fish move up into the warm waters at the top end of the bay, and there are gannets flying around the top end of the bay, and they get onto a school of these small fish together with cormorants, pelicans, gulls, terns, and in very large numbers, and provide these fabulous feeding frenzies that can be quite spectacular, anywhere from Point Gellibrand down to past Altona and beyond. The marine life, of course, in Port Phillip Bay is famous and very diverse. Things like fish and rays, sea stars, crabs, shellfish, and lots of algae. It's very spectacular. Now, the next habitat we're going to have a little look at is the basalt reefs. Most of the hills to the north and the west of Melbourne were volcanoes, and they were active until about 1 million years ago and created the relatively flat basalt plain, the Keilor Plain, which stretches from Melbourne to Geelong to Bacchus Marsh and up to Gisborne, which is part of the much larger volcanic plain that stretches into South Australia. And there are many basalt reefs, both submerged and tidal, in the western shore of the bay. This is pictures at Jawbone with the tide out. So again, a great place for birds. Lots of birds for roosting, particularly cormorants, which is a bit strange for a seabird. They actually don't have waterproof feathers, and so they need to get out of the water from time to time to dry up their feathers, and you often see them with their wings hang out to dry. There's other birds that roost, like terns. This is a whiskered tern, which is a summer visitor to southern Australia, but there's also the more common crested tern, which they love roosting on the rocks. There are also other birds like oyster catchers, which are looking for shellfish and crabs, and migratory waders, which use the basalt reefs as high tide roosts and can often be seen. The migratory waders have arrived now. They get here at the end of August and certainly by September, and there's been big flocks of redneck stints roosting down at Point Gellibrand this year, like a few thousand. and sometimes on the rocks quite close into when the tide's off a bit, quite close into the Bracks Boulevard. And they were still there last week, so it might be worth a look. Next, hang on, jumping the gun. Lots of marine life too use the basalt reefs, so things like shellfish and crabs and things. Now, moving sideways from the basalt reefs into the bay, into the muddy bits of the bay and the sandy bits of the bay, you get lots of seagrass beds, and they're also really important areas for birds like and for marine life. So marine life like these pipefish, they're hard to see sometimes in the seagrass because they look a bit like a strand of seagrass. You've got to watch and they move if you go snorkeling. Other fish, crabs, worms, shellfish, all use that. But the birds like the, oops, hang on, we jumped one there. Birds like the swans, which are herbivores, can get on the seagrass beds in quite big numbers, quite a few hundred. You go down to the mouth of Cormorant Creek. When it's not the breeding season, then you can see large numbers of swans feeding on the seagrass there, where the tide's either in or out, they don't mind. Other birds like ducks and also feed on the grass, but these Pacific gulls and other bigger waders are looking for marine life, which and then adjacent to the seagrass beds and as part of them is the mudflats. This picture's taken from above, that's Altona Coastal Park there on the left, the mouth of Cormorant Creek, and looking towards Jawbone and then Williamstown and the city. And there's a very extensive mudflats that form along that, all the way along that Altona coast and further along all the way down towards Geelong. Because the bay's so shallow, the land's so flat, and you get very extensive mudflats, which are great, very rich in invertebrate marine life, worms, shellfish, crabs, that are great food for many, many different birds. And one of the things that the western shore of Port Phillip and these mudflats in Hobsons Bay are famous among bird watchers for are the migratory wading birds. They do the big fly. They use the what they call the East Asian flyway every year. So they breed in the northern hemisphere up in Siberia and Alaska, and then fly down to Australia and New Zealand and other parts of the southern hemisphere for our summer. And you can see numbers of them on the mudflats in Hobsons Bay. This is a bar-tailed godwit, one of the bigger migratory waders. Then there's lots of little tiny ones like these stints, and then there are sandpipers and lots of other small birds. But the numbers are getting less, and the numbers of species are getting less because of disturbance on that big flyway that they use, and where in places where they used to stop to feed, like in the Yellow Sea adjacent to China and North Korea, much of it's been filled in for development, and so there's less places, less food, so there's less birds. But we also get large numbers of local wading birds like the ibises, herons, egrets, spoonbills, and some of the smaller ones like this red-capped plover that lives here all the time and again also uses the mudflats. They're becoming a little bit scarce because of habitat disturbance and even things like they breed. They just lay their eggs in the sand on a little beach or in one of the old salt works in a dry pan, but ravens catch on very quickly and predate on their eggs and their chicks. And so people from one of the universities has been doing a lot of work with these birds and other birds that use the mudflats to try and help stop the predation. Now we'll move a little bit further onto the land now, looking at mangroves. They're one of the unique plants, I think, that exists in, well, probably in the world. They live halfway between the sea and the land, so they can deal with salt water quite successfully. They live in anaerobic mud, so there's no oxygen there, but they have these pneumatophores, these roots that stick up out of the mud that allows them to breathe, and but they're primarily tropical plants. So that once you travel as far south as Victoria, there's really only one species left. This one, the white or grey mangrove. But if you go to Cairns or Darwin or somewhere up north, you might find as many as 20 or 25 or 30 species of mangrove. And they're quite spectacular and quite large trees. But there's only 5 locations that mangroves grow in Port Phillip. They're much more prolific in Western Port than then down at Corner Inlet, adjacent to Wilson's Promontory, which is about as far south as they get. And at Jawbone, though, unlike elsewhere, they're protected by a basalt platform and not in a sheltered estuary. And this is a unique. This is unique in Victoria. And so as a result of that, see, everywhere else they grow in Port Phillip and in Western Port and other places, they're protected from wave action and in estuaries sheltered, like the mangroves up Crawley Creek and the mangroves in Hovels Creek down in Limeburners Bay, for example. And because they're so unique at Jawbone, they were actually added to the Register of the National Estate, I think back in the 90s, maybe the late 80s. The mangroves provide a great nursery for marine life, like fish and crabs and shrimps, and a good habitat for small birds, using the shrubs for chasing insects and maybe even nesting, and for large birds as the tide drops for feeding, like egrets and spoonbills and the rest. Now moving just inland from the mangroves, this is Saltmarsh. There's mangroves around the edge. This is Jawbone Point. Protected by that basalt platform, and inside that there's this large area, quite large area of saltmarsh, and there's lots of saltmarsh along the western shore of Port Phillip because the bay is shallow and because the land's so flat, so that it's formed in many places. In the marsh, there's this suite of plants that can thrive in these in these saline conditions. It's nearly as salty as the sea. It gets a little bit diluted by rainwater, but the plants, mostly glassworts, the shrubby, basically a number of species of shrubby glasswort, a number of species of beaded glasswort, that the low flat one growing low in the mud. And this also provides great feeding and breeding places for birds, like this white-headed stilt with its 3 eggs on a little muddy platform out in the salt marsh. And there's a pair down there. If you go for a walk out on the boardwalk at Jawbone at the moment, there's a pair down there that I saw them last week. They have a young chick running around, and they get quite aggressive to anyone that goes out on the boardwalk. They'll fly at you and squawk and carry on very loudly. Don't actually hit you like plovers do sometimes, or magpies, but they get close. There's also migratory waders, sandpiper, and they can often be seen off the boardwalk at Jawbone. But other birds, like the white-fronted chat, which is fairly obvious, it's fairly strikingly coloured. But often can be heard with its 2 or 3 note mournful call. And if you sit still long enough and keep your eye open, they'll pop out of the vegetation. There's lots of insects live in the glassworts, particularly spiders, and sometimes along the boardwalk the shrubby glassworts get almost as filled to capacity with spider webs. Now moving up onto the dry land, there's an area of coastal shrubland that is sometimes very narrow but runs all the way, most of the way along the coast. At Jawbone, much of this community though, except for the salt bush was removed for the construction of the rifle range back in the 1870s. However, the Friends group have over the years been successfully re-establishing a narrow band of coastal shrubland between behind the shoreline, using species seen growing in similar environment in other places on the west side of Port Phillip Bay. So we've put in more salt bushes, things like these she oaks and myoporums and melaleucas, some acacias, and they've provided great feeding and nesting sites for lots of different bird species. One of the more spectacular ones, that loves sitting up on top of the salt bush at this time of the year in the breeding season, is the golden-headed cisticola. And the male is a very, this is not in breeding plumage, this bird, but it goes very rich golden colour and gets a little crest up on its head and sings its little heart out, trying to attract a female. They're quite gorgeous. And you get a group of honey eaters like the New Holland and the singing and wattlebirds, little silver eyes and fantails, and superb fairy wrens, all use that scrubland. There's lots of insects for them to feed on, and lots of flowering plants for them to get nectar from. And the other group of animals that living in this shrubland are some of the reptiles, lizards and snakes. I'll get to those a bit more in a minute. So next, if you go then inland again, there's grassland, and they were the major vegetation type on that relatively flat basalt plain, which extends from Melbourne all the way into South Australia, around the top of the Otways and around the bottom of the Grampians, and there was a very rich flora that lived on that flourished on the grasslands, but it's largely been destroyed by development, mainly agricultural development, but on the edges of Melbourne by just the expansion of the city. And there's really only less than 1% of the original cover left. So it's become quite a scarce and very threatened habitat, the grassland, the native grasslands. There are a few very small remnants of at Jawbone, mostly on the Parks Victoria side of the fence, but there's a couple on the council side as well that the Friends group's trying to rehabilitate. The mown grass areas at Jawbone that the council manage also provide areas for feeding birds that either side of the shared trail is good. So you get birds like raptors, a Nanking kestrel and the little eagle are two that visit Jawbone. Black-shouldered kites are another common one, and they're looking for insects and mice and rats and things like that. Sometimes other birds, depending on. And then some of the birds will come out of the wetland, out of the lakes, like purple swamp hens and coots and moorhens, and these black-tailed native hens, which are a bit less common. They tend to be a bird of inland waterways. When there's drought, they turn up on the coast at wetlands, and we've had them at Jawbone a number of times. We've had quite a lot of droughts over the last 20 years, so they do turn up there. And also things like crested pigeons and magpies, magpie larks, woolly wagtails, they all like that open space. The water birds just go out and feed on the grass. They eat the grass and chase insects, and it's quite, there's usually, sometimes you get quite big flocks of them out there. Also, yellow rump thornbills are a fairly common bird of the open land, and brown quail. There were brown quail at the old rifle range. There's that huge area of grassland, and there were quite good numbers there, and they bred there. And then when it was developed and the houses were built and the lakes were put in, they disappeared for a while, but they've come back now and they're breeding there again. You can see them running around. They can be seen in the grassland, but also in that shrubland as well. They're quite important. Now, the last habitat I was going to talk about is the freshwater wetlands that were constructed at Jawbone. But whether they're constructed or whether they're natural, they're incredibly important places for water birds. And where they're permanent, they provide a valuable refuge during those inland droughts. So you often get large numbers of birds. You know, when we had drought relatively recently, you're getting large numbers of ducks, for example, on these lakes at Jawbone and at other places along in the southern areas where there was permanent water. Birds often fly between fresh and salt water, looking for food and places to roost. And seabirds will come in, like cormorants particularly, and use the fresh water, and gulls and terns use the fresh water for washing and drinking, roosting on the rocks that were put in. And so you get feeding and breeding happening at Jawbone. Ducks are common birds, like the blue-billed duck there and the pink-eared duck. They're two of the more spectacular ones, and then bill's down at the moment though, and that's a male that gets that gorgeous sky blue bill at the moment when it's breeding season. Out of breeding season in winter and at the end of autumn, the blue fades from the bill and it looks slightly less spectacular. Hoary-headed grebes, as well as Australasian grebes and the big crested grebe, are all at Jawbone nearly all the time, and little black-fronted dotterels and other birds that use the edge. Bigger wading birds like spoonbills roost and feed, and they'll also go over to the mudflats and feed when the tide's off a bit. You'll often see them there feeding. As well as herons and ibis, and there's quite a collection. Now there's also a lot of reed beds at the rakes at Jawbone, and so there's a whole suite of birds that use them. One of them, the Australian Reed-warbler, that little bird up the top left there, is also a migrant, but it doesn't go further than Northern Australia for our winter, but comes back down to Southern Australia to breed, builds a nest in the reeds, and you can hear them calling nearly all the time, a very melodious call that through spring into summer. Then there's some more cryptic birds like the rails and crakes, which they live there all the time, but they're not easy to see, and you can hear them sometimes, but it's fairly minimal calls. But if you sit quietly for a while in likely spots, they pop out looking for things. You know, they're busy looking for food all the time. There's also a whole group of reptiles that live as in the grassland, the wetland, and use the shrubland. There's tiger snakes, which are common, and they've been out in this, you know, as soon as it starts to warm up. Same with the blue-tongued lizards. They're both quite common. There are little skinks, and occasionally a white-lipped snake's been seen at Jawbone, which is a bit less common and not dangerous. There's I've mentioned the boardwalk at Jawbone, which is a great place to go and view some of the wildlife that uses the mangroves and the saltmarsh. And then there's a bird hide down at the southern end of Maddox Road, the little dirt section that runs alongside the sporting fields. There's a bird hide down the end there that provides great views of the mouth of Cormorant Creek and across the mudflats and the seagrass beds to see the wildlife that uses those habitats. Now, so that's basically an overview of the various habitats that exist at Jawbone. And as with most conservation reserves, there's significant threats to these habitats, especially as Jawbone and the other wildlife reserves in Hobsons Bay are in an urban environment. So some of those threats are disturbance by development. So when the rifle range was developed for houses and the lakes were put in, there was quite a lot of disturbance and birds and wildlife were upset. There's people, there's another major disturbance, and people with dogs. There's a dog beach in Altona, and some people like to walk all the way across the sandbar to Jawbone, and causes major disturbance among the birds. They're not supposed to, but that happens. There's people and bikes. Bikes go off the track and into the shrubland. Then there's introduced animals. Plenty of foxes in Hobsons Bay. This one's have made a meal of a coot down at Jawbone. There's also cats, whether they're domestic cats or wild cats, rabbits. And then in the bay, there are northern sea stars, which have been introduced, and they're in the marine sanctuary or in the bay. And in the freshwater wetlands, there are mosquito fish that have been introduced. There's also illegal fishing and shellfish poaching, which impeaches upon the marine sanctuary. The marine sanctuary has been there for over 20 years now, and most people are well aware of its existence. There's markers like that yellow post there that delineate the boundary, and it's not very big, and most people stay away, stay outside of it. There's plenty of other areas of Port Phillip Bay that aren't off limits. And then because it's in an urban environment and around, there's lots of industry, you get pollution sometimes. Earlier this year, there was an oil spill and affected a lot of the vegetation, the Saltmarsh, and some of the birds got affected by the oil, like that sandpiper and that stilt. And things like vandalism. And then, of course, there's the one hanging over everybody's head, climate change. Because Western Port Bay is, because of western shoreline of Port Phillip Bay, sorry, is shallow and the land is very flat, any sea level rise would cause a lot of disturbance and destruction of a lot of these habitats, the basalt reefs, the seagrass beds, the mud flats, moving into the salt marsh and maybe even the grasslands. So that's probably about all I've got to say. If there's any questions, Lynn? Oh, you've got your microphone off, Lynn.
Thank you. You'd think I'd know by now, wouldn't you?
Oh, no.
We don't actually have any questions come up yet, but I'll ask one.
Yep.
How do you see, if you're talking about the disturbance to the Asian flyway and
yes,
less birds coming to us to Hobsons Bay because of that, is there anything that we can do from Australia that either, is it just we can only concentrate on what's in our own backyard, or is there any actions that we can take that will help preserve stuff in other countries, seeing it impacts so much on the birds that come to us?
Well, as individuals, it's probably difficult. But there are a number of organisations, and one of them's BirdLife Australia, that does a lot of work with other bird organisations in the countries along the flyway, like Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, China, Japan, both Koreas, and then into Russia, Eastern Russia, that are trying to make land managers in those countries and aware of the importance of the mudflats that exist there. There's a number of problems, but one of the things that happened, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, was that one of the migratory birds that comes to Australia is the red knots and great knots, and their particular choice of food was a shellfish that was prolific in the Yellow Sea that they used for passage migration, that looked a bit like a pippy. And one year, for some reason or other, I guess some people know why, but I haven't. There weren't any, or there were very, very few. And so what the bird organisations did was got funding from various places and bought large numbers of these shellfish off fishermen in other places where they were more common in that particular year, and distributed them over the mudflats off China, and actually saved the knots that year. They didn't starve, they got enough to eat, and they managed to get to Australia. Not many of them get to southern Australia, to Victoria anymore, but certainly to northern Australia there's still lots around Broome and Darwin and into Queensland. But we used to get, it's one of the birds we used to get relatively commonly along this western shoreline, but it's much less so now. So things like that. And so you joining those organisations is one way of helping, but I mean, you get lots, as I said in the talk, you do get lots of disturbances in wetlands, and in Australia, and organisations like BirdLife and also local councils do quite a lot of work trying to protect those areas and to raise awareness of the birds that use those areas through education programs. And I suppose, you know, talks like this, there's been quite a lot happening. Hobsons Bay have a migratory bird day every year at the end of in autumn when they're leaving, and again in September when they're arriving back again. And they had a very successful one, a Zoom one this year in September, where there was quite a lot of, they had some good speakers and some great presentations. So it's hard, but.
Yeah, okay. Now that's a good answer, thanks.
That's all right.
So we've got a couple other questions started to come in. Someone wants to know, are the photos you used your own photos?
Oh, sorry, I should have said that at the start. No, most of them were taken by other members of local friends groups. There's Andrew Thornton, who's a member of our Williamstown Wetlands group. He took a lot of the photos, and another friend who's a member of the Lower Cormorant Creek Friends group, Len Towsey, he took quite a few of the photos. So they were all, I think they were all taken locally, or maybe except for the pipefish, but all the rest of the photos were taken locally.
Okay.
I got the pipefish off the internet. But they are there, I've seen them.
Okay, we've got a question for you asking where's the best place to snorkel in the Marine Reserve?
Oh yeah, now I should have mentioned that. The Marine Reserve is a very good place for snorkelling. There's really only one access point, and that's off the beach at the eastern end of the reserve. There's access to the beach there at the back of the high school. You can come in that way, or you can come off Rifle Range Drive and walk across, and there's paths down to the beach there, and yeah, you can get in the water there and snorkel, well, in that little bay, but also around the point. And if you go at high tide and there's a little bay at the back of Jawbone Point that's surrounded by mangroves, and it's part of that. And you can get in there at high tide and have a look at some of the marine life in the mangroves there. It's all very spectacular, but there is some brilliant stuff to look at underwater there.
Okay.
And there is a marine, I won't get the name right, but there's a marine care group for Jawbone Sanctuary that operates through Parks Victoria here at the Williamstown office in Nelson Place. So you could get some information, and they do lots of activities in the Marine Sanctuary.
Okay, okay, I've got a comment here. This is a long one. It says the walkway and area just to the city side of the Westgate Bridge, just past the memorial. I understand this is owned or managed by Parks Victoria. The walkway has been blocked off for some months, possibly for restoration. Is it worth trying to ask what the plan is to make this area available to the public again?
Yeah, it is for restoration. There's problems with the actual boardwalk. It's not safe. It's been there for at least 30 years, and it was built on a number of old pylons that were already in the water. And I think Parks Victoria are working to fix it, but it's going to take time and money. But the government is providing money for restoration of such boardwalks and for a lot of the piers around Melbourne at the moment. So I think they made $6 million available relatively recently. One of the things that's, to diverge slightly, one of the things that's going to happen out of that $6 million is Altona Pier is going to get completely rebuilt next to the existing pier.
Oh.
But getting back to the boardwalk under Westgate Bridge, yeah, it's a great place for looking at mangroves. And those mangroves there were planted there in the 1980s and were nearly wiped out by a spill that came down Stony Creek soon afterwards. But enough survived to provide the huge numbers of plants that are there now. Ringing the Parks Victoria office in Williamstown or calling in there, I think you can call in there at the moment with COVID. They'll be able to give you more information about how long it's going to take to get that boardwalk back and running, because I know people like going over there excuse me, to fish in the river and, well, just to have a look. You can get on the north side of that Stony Creek backwash, you can get along through the trees and shrubs there. You can get across to I think you can get across to the river. There's certainly a walking path, and there's a car park over the road, over Douglas Parade there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so another question we've got about other sea stars you mentioned as being an invasive species, the only kind of sea stars in the reserve.
No, there's lots of native sea stars. I mean, I'm not an expert on the marine life, but there are quite a number of native species of sea star. The introduced one, that's one of the activities I think that the Marine Care Group have been working on, is removing them from, at least from the sanctuary. And from I think that they've been quite successful at that. So there aren't many there anymore. And so most of the ones you would see there would be native ones. Okay. I think that's right.
Okay, I've also got another question for you, Richard. The Friends group, I know with COVID they're not meeting, but how often would you normally meet, and are you open to volunteers coming in?
Oh, absolutely. We're always happy to have anyone who wants to come along and join in some of the activities, more than welcome. You could find out information about the Friends group from Hobsons Bay Council. They have information on their website about all the Friends groups. The Williamstown Wetlands group also has if you Google it, there is a website that also has information about how to join the group. And normally we would have activities at least on the last Sunday of every month, except for January and December. Yeah, that's right. And activities like Clean Up Australia Day, bird walks, plant walks, planting, moving mulch, weeding. That probably covers most of it. And then we do have extra activities occasionally for when there's specific things that need doing. We work in conjunction with both Parks Victoria and Hobsons Bay Council, just depending on which part of the reserve we're working on. And sometimes they, that we all work together, the three, our group and the two government bodies on particular areas. We've put a lot of work into an arboretum down there over the last 13 or 14 years, where we've planted it out with species that are indigenous to, well, probably would have been indigenous to Williamstown, certainly Hobsons Bay, and have labelled them with plant names and put paths in, and it's become, and it looks out across the bay. It's on that high ground, not near the entrance, near where you walk down to the boardwalk. So yeah, there's always lots going on, and I think there's about, I think it's 8 Friends groups in Hobsons Bay that normally would have activities regularly throughout the year. Yeah.
Thank you.
In
okay.
Some different habitats.
Yeah. With someone's asking about the details of the Park Victoria for snorkeling. They didn't get all the information down. So what I'll do is I'll send everyone out an email. I'll find those details out for you and just send them out with an email for you.
Yeah. The park staff at Williamstown would, yeah. And you've got contacts for them, Lynn?
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, they would be able to tell you.
Yeah.
Well, when Parks Victoria have just announced this week that they're willing for volunteers to now go into the parks and do activities. It's social distancing and no more than 10 people at a time, but they have said that can happen again. So I assume that some summer marine care activities will take place, but I haven't heard definitely that's happening. But our group's going to undertake, have a couple of weeding days between now and Christmas, which are fairly casual and involve a bit of bird watching and a bit of, all sorts of things. Quite a lot of chatting, and yeah, so they're quite good fun.
Okay. Okay, so we've just got some general comments here. Thanking you for the presentation and including the background of the development of the reserve. Another comment about the arboretum is great. And you just got a basic comments just saying thank you very much for the great session. And learned a huge amount about the area today.
Good. It's very accessible, Jawbone. I mean, in the sense that it's part of the Bay Trail, and you can easily get onto the boardwalk, which allows you access to the coast. But the coast from the boardwalk west, which is managed by Parks Victoria, is pretty much off limits until you get to Paisley Chalice Wetland, when you can go down to that bird hide and that's at the bottom of Maddox Road and have a look there. And that's basically to protect the habitat for the wildlife. That's why it's off limits. But, you know, to go snorkeling, you can go onto that little beach to the east of the boardwalk of Jawbone Point. And I must say that on Cup Day, there were quite a few hundred people down on that little beach.
I bet there was.
I think it was an overflow from the main beach. Everyone was so glad to be out and about. It was such a lovely day. Okay,
so if we don't have any more comments coming in, that's pretty much our time up. I'll just say to everybody that even though I said I was going to record it, I forgot to push the record button until partway through. So if you do go and look at it on YouTube, there will be the very start of it is missing. I'm going to apologise for that. So we'll call it quits there, and just everybody's just saying thank you. And I'll thank Richard personally for being available of his time today. It's very interesting talk. Thank you, Richard.
Oh, that's a pleasure. It was good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Okay, and thanks everyone else for attending, and we'll see you another time.
Good. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for organising.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's almost everyone gone now.
Good. We did well to get, was it 18, was it?
We ended up with, I think it was 16, not
16.
including you and I think.
Oh, 18 was okay.
I think so, yes.
Oh, good.
So well, that's well done, yeah.
Yeah, given it's, you know, now people can do lots of different things. And
yes.
It's a sunny Saturday morning, so that was good.
Well, that's right, and because now you can get out and about, they're not the captive audience anymore.
No, talking to Andrew Webster the other day, he's still got a couple more Zoom presentations to give, and he doesn't know when to do them because because you know people can. It's all right when you're under lockdown, but harder now.
Yeah, because people don't want to be on the computers.
No, they do not. They're sick to death of it.
I can understand that.
Yes.
Yeah. So some of the council have done quite a few of their
they have
the videos lately and all the habitat stuff. It's been a really good interesting year for that sort of stuff.
It has. There's been a lot of information about Hobsons Bay parks and wildlife out there for people to look at on Zoom this year. A lot of their stuff's available on YouTube, the council, most of it.
Yeah, I found that they had a YouTube channel a couple of weeks ago. They've got all those videos available for people to go and have a look at. So that's really good.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'll say thank you again for that because
pleasure, Lynn.
That really was excellent.
Good.
And I'll let you go off and enjoy the rest of your day. Maybe get out in the sunshine.
Go out and get a bit of sunshine. That'll be nice.
Yeah.
You too. You're not doing any more work today, are you? It's Saturday.
No, that's it. I'm packing up now.
Good. Excellent. Okay.
All right. Thanks again, Richard.
Good, Lynn. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.